This session is titled Cybersecurity Breaches Are in the News, How Internal Assessments Can Help You Avoid One. This session will be presented by Kane McGladrey and Jessica Pratt. Kane is Field CISO at Hyperbrew, and Jessica is the Security Compliance Specialist at Pythian. To learn more about Kane and Jessica and ways to connect with them, please visit the speaker window to the right of your console. Without further ado, I will hand it over to Kane to start the presentation. Kane, you may begin.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Jessica, I'm really excited to be presenting with you today. And before the presentation, you and I were talking about how you've got a background in museum studies and history. And would you be willing to share a little bit about how that's prepared you for a compliance role?
Yeah, you wouldn't think that something like that would prepare someone for a compliance role, but actually there's a lot of skill sets that I learned back in my historical and my museum educational experience that I was able to carry into my compliance role here at Pythian. Some three big areas that I've really noticed throughout the last 5 years is that it's a lot of researching and critical thinking is involved in my job, which is what I did a lot as a historian and what I did a lot in the museum field is I'm taking evidence, I'm providing context to that evidence, trying to understand why this is important to our organization and especially to security investigations, and particularly when it comes to doing audit reports. I also learned that there's a lot of communication and writing involved. You do a lot of writing when you're in a museum field, writing out displays so people will understand the material that you're trying to present to them in museums as well as in historical documentation. You're also trying to do the same thing in the security compliance field because you're writing up policies and procedures and guidelines, and you got to make them accessible to your readers so they understand what you're asking of them. And then the biggest thing I really recognized was project management. I learned a lot about project management when I was doing my museum program because it was a program focused on running a museum, a small museum, just yourself. And you often have to involve a lot of different departments when you decide you want to build out an exhibit. And it's kind of the same thing in the security compliance field. My job, I'm often working with the IT department when we're rolling out security initiatives, or if they have projects where they need to decommission products, decommission servers, or I'm working with other departments when they have to build up processes and policies when it's onboarding clients and offboarding them. We have to make sure that security is built into those processes and procedures. So I'm often doing a lot of project management in my job.
That sounds like a daunting amount of task. I'm sure that the entire audience is, or at least many of the compliance professionals in the audience, they face challenges like that daily. But the other question I wanted to ask you about, you use the word artifacts, and I've heard the words artifacts, evidence, proof, and monuments used interchangeably in our field. And I wanted to ask if there's a specific term that you use with your team that you find is most accepted, something people get when you say, hey, I need proof that you did the thing. Which word do you use?
I use evidence. When I first started, it was artifact, and they just didn't understand. I'm like, oh, I need your security artifact. And they're just like, I don't understand what that is. They think it's something that you put on display and you look at it and you're like, it's an old piece of material, where now I say evidence. And they're like, yes, I did the thing that I did. Here's my evidence to prove that I did. I'm following the control process.
Got it. Okay, well, who knows? Maybe at some point in the future, all of the security ephemera that we've created will end up in some museum somewhere. But until then, I think the audience has had an opportunity to familiarize themselves with the agenda and also realize that we're not the types of people who read slides. So I want to move to our first big topic of the day, and that's going to be around the topic of what we're expecting to see in risk in 2023. But because I've got a historian on the call, is it okay if I call you a historian? Because you've got historical background,
Yeah.
right? Okay, so I want to take a slight look back before we look forward into 2023. And I want to start off with the events that happened. I think many people are familiar with them, the regulatory enforcement actions and what lessons we can draw from those actions from Uber. So that was a big case last year where, for those of you who, I don't even actually know, maybe you missed this one, Joe Sullivan was Uber's former CISO. And you can see some examples of things that happened with him. He was also a former federal prosecutor, and that makes an interesting bit of context associated with him. He's a former federal prosecutor, former CISO of Uber. He's currently serving some time in Club Fed. And I wanted to ask Jessica, based on what you've seen, was there a systemic failure and a lack of oversight or partnership between the CISO and the executive team? Or was this really just a case of a former federal prosecutor who made a serious mistake of judgment?
Well, when you look at the evidence that's being presented before us in those articles and just what happened with Joe Sullivan, it looks like it was both a systematic failure as well as a serious mistake on Joe Sullivan's part. Because when you look at a public company like Uber, something like that shouldn't happen. And you're wondering, well, how can that happen? And why was it also kept a secret? Because looking further into it, at the same time that this was coming out, they're also undergoing an audit from from previous security breaches that weren't reporting correctly, and then another on top of that, another security breach happens and you don't report that or you don't open that up to your auditors. And it makes you wonder, well, what controls are missing within Uber to not allow someone to be able to make that decision on their own. So it's finding interesting that Uber, the company itself, was not held accountable for the governance decisions that should be in place to keep someone from going on their own and making that decision, especially when you're undergoing an audit and you're under that already a lot of scrutiny by your auditors. So to me, it seems like Uber was lacking a range of internal controls from the board level, financial level, as well as operational controls when it comes to cybersecurity investigation. And then another part of it, I can't help but feel that Joe Sullivan is being used as a bit of a scapegoat because of his reputation, because of his experience. He's being put up as saying, look, if you guys are not doing what you're supposed to be doing, this is what can happen. And it doesn't matter who you are as an individual, you're going to be held accountable for those actions. So I kind of feel like he's been scapegoated a bit, but at the same time too, why isn't his company being also held, the company that he works for also being held accountable for those actions, because they should have the controls in place that he shouldn't have been able to make that serious mistake.
Yeah, I think it's interesting also. We did a study at Hyperproof of the market and found out that 1/3 of the companies we chatted with have actually made changes to how the CISO works with legal and works with the senior executive team in direct response to what happened here. So I think one of the big takeaways really that we keep hearing is, like you said it yourself, like if you are currently undergoing a federal investigation and something else happens, you might want to mention it because otherwise it looks like you're going to have a rough time. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Well, let's move past that. I want to cover one other case that occurred just, I guess this one was last year, and it's also kind of funny. It's related to an acquisition of Uber's. Funny that, right? So this was an FTC, Federal Trade Commission enforcement action at Drizzly. And this is intriguing because previously the FTC has been more on sanctioning rather than into enforcement. But in this case, they actually put together an enforcement order, and it ordered not only the company Drizzly, but they actually personally called out the CEO, right? Like, when you're get in trouble with your parents and they use your full name. I mean, this is one of those sorts of situations where they specifically sanctioned the CEO because they found that the company didn't have a cybersecurity program. Like, not that it was kind of weak or not that it was kind of like, maybe they could make some tune-ups. They just plain old didn't have one. What are some things that we could do that other companies could do really to prevent that kind of a deleterious outcome?
Well, the first thing, yeah, we're reading about the Drizzly case. That was really interesting because ultimately, when it comes to, is ultimately the failure of management at the end of the day. Like you feel for the CEO that he's being held responsible for it, but at the same time, too, though, that was your responsibility as CEO to make sure that you had a qualified security professional in place to build a security program and as well as continue the protection of the assets of the company. That's what your security program is doing. It's not just there to make everyone's lives difficult. It's there to protect the company and make sure that our assets are being protected. So something that could help to have that prevention is hire a qualified security professional who can be able to implement an enterprise level security program with well-worn features to ensure that this doesn't happen again. So this person isn't being held accountable and have this carry with them for the rest of their life, that whatever organization they are going to work in, they now have to make sure that they have a security program involved, which should already be embedded into the growth of the company.
Yeah, and I think this is also, we'll get into it in a few minutes here, but this is pointing towards the future of regulatory change. I want to look at one last example, just to give another example. This one related to the the SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission. And they got into it with Morgan Stanley over data disposition. And what happened in this case is the bank gave some hard drives and some devices containing sensitive information on consumers to a moving and storage company. And that might seem like a bit of a weird fit, but go with it because this is a thing that happened. And the moving and storage company, surprise, they didn't quite know how to get rid of hard drives. And so they just decided to sell them on. Because what do we do with some hard drives? Well, I guess we could sell them. So they've recovered some of the hard drives since then, but they haven't recovered all of the hard drives since then. And I think the SEC wasn't real happy when they heard about this. But this is not a new problem, right? Like companies, they often will need to get rid of older devices or outdated hardware. So, looking at this one, are there any policies or procedures or artifacts or monuments that other companies might need to look at in light of this enforcement action?
Oh, definitely. Reading about this was really interesting because it was like a couple things came up when I was reading about what happened. It was, what was their asset management and decommission policies like for Morgan and Stanley? It was it not laid out somewhere what they were responsible for in terms of building out an inventory to track the assets that were going out? But how was the IT director handling the removal of these devices and working with the company that they contracted to do this? Another big interesting item that you had pointed out was that these devices that were not only just being decommissioned and then eventually sold out, they still had sensitive data on them, which was a huge red flag right there to make me want to look back and say, well, what was the reviewing their offboarding process and policy procedures when it came to devices being returned? Because a lot of us in the IT field, we often have devices supplied to us by our company. And so we have to send it back. There should be a process in place in which the devices are being wiped, returned to the inventory. We know we're going to eventually decommission them, but there's that gap is not being left open for that to happen. And then the big thing that I go back to all the time and something that I'm very passionate about is vendor management and looking at our contracts when it comes to working with our vendors. We have to have a strong understanding with the companies that we are engaging in when we are handing over these devices. Like, we don't want to just say this is just a brick for you to handle and destroy. We're like, this brick actually could potentially have sensitive information on it. So we want to make sure we're employing certified e-recyclers to take care of these devices and dispose of them properly, but also having appropriate contracts in place with these vendors that tells them what the standards are, the asset, showing them that there's asset tracking, that we'll be able to track these assets, like literally spelling out what they need to happen in the contract, providing a certificate to us at the end, telling them this is what you can or can't do, so that at the end of the day, Morgan Stanley was also protected. So it just looks like they didn't have any of that in place.
Yeah, and you've covered down on a lot of things there. And I remember I used to work with a great Army counterintelligence officer, former counterintelligence officer, and the way that he would train new recruits on data recovery techniques was he'd go to local stores, anywhere from like the Goodwill to the local computer shop to the local electronics recycler. He'd just buy the hard drives or get the hard drives for free, and he'd take them back on base and be like, cool, let's all do some data recovery. And inevitably it was a horror show. Right. It was just nonstop, endless, like things that the recruits would go, wow, this is really easy, because there was not that culture in wiping. And so I think you're right in that companies do have pretty much an obligation at this point to not only prioritize the risks associated with their third-party vendors that are doing data disposition for them, but also to validate, like, did they get a certificate of destruction showing that it had been adequately destroyed or not? Does that sound like a fair possible control here?
Oh, definitely. It's a fair control that can be happen and is already employed in some companies that I know.
Right. Right. And so we've kind of taken a look back, and I wanted to start with that historical look as it points towards future potential regulatory change, right? Because everything we've seen in security, everything we've seen in compliance, typically 5 years from now, you can look at a bad thing that happened, and that's usually 4 to 5 years, how long it'll take for either regulatory bodies or full lawmakers to actually enact that as a change. So kind of, keep these ones in mind, but I want to keep us moving forward. And, we've talked about some security breaches here. I want to cover down on why is this so popular? Like, is it that we're just having more breaches? Are things getting worse? Is Twitter actually telling me the truth? Because like 5 years ago, cybersecurity news was, let's be honest, like, it was a bit of a niche. I've been doing this for 25 years now, and even 5 years ago, like, was not a trending topic. But these days, cybersecurity and breaches especially are a recurring topic in the media and in the news, and that can be either nation state on nation state or nation state on private company or threat actor on private company. Especially happens when we get breaches. So are we just getting better at reporting the breaches, or are things getting worse?
I think we're getting better at reporting breaches, but I also think it's because we are legitimately online more now than we ever been in the last 10 years. Like the pandemic kind of forced us all to be online more and to recognize what is happening on social media, on the news outlets. And so we're seeing a lot more bad news in our feed all the time. And we all know that bad news sells. People are going to want to go to someone's website because they're going to read the latest bad thing that happened to another bigger company. Another thing that I've also have been recognizing is we're seeing more whistleblowers. We're seeing a lot more people coming out within these organizations and saying, actually, your data isn't protected. These things aren't private. Whatever you're putting, like Twitter to be an example, whatever you're putting on Twitter, it's being kept or it could be leaked or potentially breached in some way, shape, or form. So people are seeing that more now, and a lot more people are. Some people are actually sometimes questioning more of what they're putting online and what they want to ask about. And I think another thing that I've also recognized is that some of these breaches that are happening are targeting nonprofit and health organizations, and we're seeing a lot more of that because there's this activism that's involved. That if you more people are concerned about if a hospital has been breached because that's so much sensitive data, important information that's being put out there. And that can be, unfortunately, a political thing that's also happening too. So we're seeing that more now because of these other organizations that are being attacked.
So you've just covered like why I regularly are not I'm not normally doom scrolling on Twitter. And part of the reason why is it just it causes mental fatigue. And I wanted to ask about that. Like from your perspective, do you think people still care? Right? Like a company gets breached. Are they just so acclimated to seeing this in the news and in their social feeds and like in the letters they're receiving in their mail? Or do they still actually like get interested when there's a breach?
I will agree with you that there are people who are getting tired because they don't know what to believe anymore with the news that's coming out or what is right. But I feel like people who are interested are appreciate this information coming out because it allows them to be able to do further research into it and find out like how does is this company that this tool has or this company is really going to impact what they're doing or they're doing their research online. But another big thing I've really recognized, that I've felt this as well too, is a bit of helplessness. You find out there's a breach, they don't really tell you what you need to do. And oftentimes you find out the breach on like through news. You don't get sent an email saying your data was potentially breached. Sometimes you receive those emails months after the breach has happened. And for example, LastPass, they had a breach. The investigation, the scope of it was wrong, and we didn't find out until much later what was happening
Oh
with
yeah, that one just kept
that.
that dumpster fire started and it just kept burning and like it turned out that like the parent company had been shelled and they also lost their encryption keys, which that's just straight up horrifying, right?
Exactly, but we're not being given the notification about that. So we feel pretty helpless at the end of the day of what do we do when we are given this information. They don't necessarily tell us. For an example, 7 years ago, someone walked out of with a server from OSAP, Canada. It's a loan organization here in Canada. They just walked out with a server that had a bunch of people's information and data on it. And what did they tell the consumers that were impacted? Sign up for Equifax. And just for the rest of your life, just check to make sure that your data is not being used anywhere, right? So there's like this helplessness that people just don't know what to do once your data is out there. What can I do now?
And somehow I love that you mentioned somebody just walked out with a server. I can think of many years ago I was doing a threat intel. We call it a Tiger team at the time. It's analogous to red teaming on a new government facility, and they put their brand new server on casters, like little wheels, and they put it in the front lobby, right? And they had a glass door, non-reinforced, with no bollards, and a concrete ramp because it was ADA compliant. And they asked me, "Could you do a security assessment?" And I'm like, "Yeah." So you don't really need one because all you can do is just back the truck up, take the server, off you go. By um, it now that was 20 years ago. The fact that you're saying that 7 years ago that happened, that is still troubling. Okay. The other thing you touched on a little bit there was around companies' risks of how they're being perceived. And something I've often counseled organizations on is around reputational damage in case of a breach. Thinking of the number of breaches and just consumer behavior, does that even matter anymore as a qualitative measure?
I often think sometimes it depends on the nature of the business and the company and the type of breach that happens and how it impacts the company's ability to bounce back and how much do they care about their reputational damage. Like I know some companies that are just like their reputation is very important to them and their clients and the customers. So having a breach is like, it can be a hard hit, but it's the way that they go about responding to that breach is what's going to help them with their reputation in the end. If they have a good public response and they go out with the best defense, they're eventually their reputation is going to be repaired over time because they're eventually going to earn their clients' trust back again. But the moment you go out there and you're being private about it and you don't really respond to it, then of course people are going to start losing trust, and no one's going to trust that organization, and your reputation is eventually going to be tarnished at the end of the day. So if you do this correctly, responding to these breaches in a very transparent way, you're able to not only you can direct your risk program to focus on those areas that are more risky and that will impact the company's decisions and future relationship with their clients.
Okay, but I want to provide a counterpoint there. I can think of a telecom provider, a phone company. They've been breached 8 times now in 4 years, and they keep sending out letters about, we care about user privacy and we care about your security. I recently got one because I've got like I don't know, I think my telephone provider uses their network partially, and so I got swept up in it too. I didn't feel very good about it. But do messages like that reassure regulatory bodies as well as the larger market, or is this just a little bit of like playing catch up and trying to bury the story? Because again, 8 times in 4 years, it doesn't seem like they care.
No, it doesn't. Like to hear something like that is like, do they care at all? I think what they're doing is relying on the fact that consumers do have short memories. Eventually, they'll forget about that breach. They'll be like, oh, okay, they'll get that email, they'll read the information, they'll be like, okay, well, I'll just continue forward unless they feel like they're really impacted and they need to move forward. But at the end of the day, like money speaks. And if this telecom company is not seeing the dip in profits because people are all of a sudden leaving their services, they feel like they've done enough. They're like, we've done our due diligence. It's fine. But regulators should start questioning and start looking at this and being like, well, this doesn't seem right. Why are you keep sending out these emails if you're having these breaches and also reporting to us all these breaches? We need to start discussing whether we need to start fining you or in your programs to make sure that you're in alignment with what you're actually telling us as well as your clients.
And I think that really speaks to the larger narrative that we're seeing here, where the behaviors of the past are really shaping the future. And I think we're going to see a bit of an increase really in the number of internal assessments that companies are going to have to prepare for to meet their new regulatory, statutory, legal, or contractual burdens in a direct response to this. So as we move into our next big topic for the day, I want to talk a little bit on we've talked about the SEC, we've talked about FTC. We didn't bring them up, but New York Department of Financial Services. Every one of those agencies got either proposed rules or new rules that companies are going to need to meet, and they're going to drive additional internal control assessments. So thinking of the larger macroeconomic climate we're working in right now, is this something where we think we can just hire our way out of the situation to prepare for this? Or is there something else that companies can do to prepare for this increase in assessments?
Well, I think before people start jumping into like hiring all the best people to be able to solve their problems is sit down first and get organized with the staff that you already have in place and find out what your compliance requirements are and get them structured in the way that you can meet those regulatory requirements. Sometimes it often just takes looking at a control and working with it to say this will meet this framework or this requirement. That way, this can show whether you need to hire someone to work in those various skill sets, or if requiring a tool will help you offset the need to hire and get that because you already have that staff in place and they can use the skill sets that they already have to meet those regulatory requirements. And then based upon getting organized, you can then start reporting to your leadership team about these controls, what type of evidence you need to be able to support these controls, what are your findings in these policies that are in place that are maybe not working the way they should be. And then that allows your stakeholders to be informed more about the maturity level of your risk management program, of your security compliance program, which is then going to help them dictate what further they need within the company to meet these regulatory requirements. Another big thing I've also recognized that has been really important when it comes to getting organized is building out dashboards. Dashboards is like a tool that are really super helpful to help us give us a big oversight of our risk management program. And if you have a compliance dashboard that's showing you a bunch of red items, then at least you know you have a problem where you need to be able to start addressing it. If you can't show any red on your dashboard, then you end up having a bigger problem because things are not being reported correctly. Things are not organized the way they should be for you to be able to see the evidence in front of you.
So that's I love where you're going with that and the idea of a dashboard, and those are super useful for executive teams and for senior executives to understand, how things are going at a macro level. But can you give the audience any specific examples of improvements you've made to support faster, better, cheaper improvements to process or control assessments?
Yeah, so a big thing for me that helped was centralization. Everything is in one place for me. I don't have to go to all kinds of different areas, different spreadsheets, different Google folders to find my evidence. I have it all centralized in one area, so I have a complete oversight of what I need to see, and then and then at the end of the day, it's dictating what I need to focus on my day to day. Particularly when it comes to evidence collection, is so much more seamless for me. And then I'm able to gather this evidence, but then I'm also able to build out testing conditions. So before, you would do like a random spot check item every quarter or something like that on something that you feel is not working. Well, now I'm able to set up a monthly testing automation that allows me to say, here's my conditions. I need you to test this out. And then it tells me, okay, this evidence for this control, you need to start reviewing this because it's failing this control. And then I can see why. So I have so much more insight into what I need to do to keep building out a stronger compliance program.
So you've centralized all of your evidence storage, and you're doing some more regular testing. That sounds like it wouldn't scale though, right? Like, what if you've got multiple? Like, let's say you're at a finance company or a fintech company, because goodness knows they deal with a swirling morass of things like
Mhm.
GLBA and NYDFS and probably SOX if they're public, right? Should they plan on having multiple separate internal centralized locations of assessments just to keep things separate? Or should they actually look at consolidating those into a single motion and single storage location?
I would recommend consolidation because centralization is part of that whole consolidation process where internal assessments for every frame, like I sometimes think that companies get concerned about internal assessments and they think that it's going to be really time consuming and then they're not going to get any worth out of it in the end. But when you consolidate your internal assessments, you're able to meet the different framework requirements and you're able to see exactly what you need to focus on because tooling itself allows us to link a single control item to regulatory frameworks, which 80% of them are really the same. They're all asking a lot of the same thing. They're just written out in different ways to adjust to that framework. And then you can see the 20% of what are really unique to that particular framework and how you need to focus on and where you need to focus on that. So the tool that we are using, it allows us also to jumpstart into other frameworks if we want to, because it's all in one place. All of my controls are already linked. And I can say, okay, well, we're now doing a SOC 2 framework, but now we want to do the ISO 27000. Okay, I have 44% of my controls meet that framework. Here's the other part that I need to work on to get to that 100%.
Okay, but now the other thing I want to ask about, and it's funny, I'm writing an article on the topic right now, is around the checkbox compliance mentality, right? And thinking of historically, like we earlier agreed, in 5 years' time, today's security failures are going to drive additional security controls, additional regulatory controls, additional compliance controls. When we've centralized all of this data collection and we've got this elegant way of expressing all of our compliance needs, how do we prevent ourselves from getting into that trap of just doing compliance for the letter of it and not for the spirit of it, where we might be compliant, like so many companies that have been breached recently, but we're not actually secure?
Uh-huh. So often I find, so this is what I feel on this is that if you're finding yourself turning to checkbox compliant, like if you're literally just going through and you're saying, yep, 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 then I think that's time to reassess the framework that you're using for your company, because maybe it's the wrong framework for the industry that you're working in or for the certification that you're looking for, because you need to step back and take a time out and say, this may need a reassessment because we're not actually doing any work around this to make sure that this is compliant. There should be active processes and guidelines in place that are meeting those requirements. And it also is another question I would ask myself is, are we in a misalignment with management objectives and what the actual teams and departments are doing within a company, and that this is maybe not the right framework, and then we don't have the right buy-in from the rest of the company with our controls.
I think that's a really good point. And you kind of spoke to it a little bit earlier there when we were talking about dashboarding. I want us to move on to just talking about, how we're going to effectively communicate this progress to senior management. And like so as a compliance professional, we know there's going to be a lot more internal assessments going on, right? And I think that, we're preparing for it in varying ways. How should senior management be looking at this increase in potential internal assessments?
I think they should be looking at them positively because you get benefits when you're conducting internal assessments. You're getting the assurance that your organization is running effectively and is compliant and is security. You don't have to worry about if there is gaps or not being monitored or looked after, as well as you able to conduct when you conduct these internal assessments, you're able to provide to your external auditors and your clients who end up relying on those reports confidence in your security program and making those decisions. You're able to say, like, I can provide you a report and a certification, and you're not walking into an external audit surprised by what comes out of it. Like, one of the big rule of thumb that we have in our organization is we don't want to be surprised by what we're walking into. So if I'm walking into an audit, I know what areas that we need to be working on, and I want my auditor to work with me to help me to make those areas better. But if I walk in there and I'm surprised by something, then I know that I failed in my duty as a compliance officer to make sure that that's not there. But then sometimes those surprises can be good because maybe it sees an oversight that I didn't see. But ultimately, I think senior management should embrace internal assessments because at the end of the day, you're going to get a report out of it that you're going to be able to give to your clients, and they're going to feel confident about your program.
And I also see there that you've got a screenshot on screen there for the audience, and the font is kind of small, but I can see that there's a risk register, and there's also a heat map shown on screen. Who'd end up using this? Is this something you put in front of your senior management team, or is this something that's used down level in the analysts team?
I think what was great about this is that anyone could really use it if you invite them into the program. It's a great way for executive leadership to be able to get a quick snapshot of what's happening in the program. And as they kind of have an area they want to question a little bit more, they can poke at. And then your security team, they're able to look at it with their control owners and be able to say, like, oh, we've got a risk that is now appearing red. Well, why is it appearing red? Well, because you've got some controls that are no longer healthy. So it shows you how integrated all this is, and people understand more and more now how important having these controls in place and making sure that they're strong and effective, because they're going to impact your risk registry at the end of the day that you're going to have to eventually present to your board and talk to them about those risks.
And talking to boards and talking about risks is a perpetual point of interest, I think, for both new CISOs as well as those who are considering becoming a CISO. Have there been any things you find to be really useful in shaping the narrative as you prepare to talk to the board about cybersecurity risks?
Mhm. So the advice that I've received from my own VP is that often when it comes to talking about these risks, you need to make them relatable to your audience. We're security professionals talking to governance people. They're not going to understand our language, but they'll understand if we're speaking to them in their language. And often that comes with being prepared when you're approaching those board members, like thinking about the questions that they should be asking you and being prepared to answer to those questions. I know often a lot of board members are always concerned about ransomware and how that impacts the business. So we often have to talk to that. But another big thing I recognize is important is connecting back to industry news. A lot of our board members and our stakeholders, they're always going to be on top of what's happening in the news, and they're going to be interested about those topics and how it relates to the business. So when you're coming to them with those risks and you want to talk to them about them, they're going to be like, well, how does this relate back to, say, a breach that happened over at Uber? How can we make sure that we don't let that happen here?
And I think you hit on a key theme there, which is that board members, they want to talk about risks, right? They don't want to hear about specific technologies. They want to hear about how the CISO and how the chief compliance officer, how they're actually effectively managing those risks, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So what about another audience that I'm thinking of other ways we could repurpose these data? Cyber insurance tends to be fairly interesting as a topic, at least to me. I think to other people who've ever went through a renewal process, right? Would you be able to take the residual risks from that heat map and from that risk register would that be able to be used in negotiations or when planning to talk to your cyber insurance broker about your renewals or policy changes?
I think it helps us internally to be able to talk to our insurance providers about these renewals, about these changes. But unfortunately, insurance companies, like their risk evaluation process is so different from the IT and security evaluations are often not aligned. And insurance companies are often much more mature with their data because they've been doing this for decades. They have the data, so they know what comes to these renewals and how they're going to approach that. Whereas security and IT, we are more mature on the technology side. So we can say, well, we're also building the data. We have the technology to show us how we're going to be able to control these risks and prove to you that we have this under control. But I find insurance companies are still a little bit inflexible when it comes to us approaching them with our information and saying, well, they often just send us a questionnaire and say, fill out this questionnaire, and then we'll decide from there this renewal.
Okay, but if anything else though, like if you saw that you'd had effective controls deployed that minimized your risk below an acceptable level of tolerance, you could decide to self-insure, right? And say, no, we don't want, like, let's say, I don't know, ransomware was a threat. You mentioned ransomware earlier. Like, let's say if you knew you had really good EDR, really good backups, and really good data exfiltration to minimize the risks associated with that. I think you could at least use that to say when you're talking to your broker, like, okay, the ransomware policy, we don't need that, right?
Yes. Oh, definitely. I think that it informs us more as a company to say when it comes to those negotiations. I don't want to say negotiations with insurance providers, but there's a point, a kind of negotiation that you want to say like, okay, well, we can cover it, but we do need this to be covered because we know that this is an area that we're working on.
Fantastic. Well, I want to keep us moving forward as well before we rabbit hole further on insurance. And I want to start moving towards operational concerns because what we've seen here, like we've got a world where world events are driving more internal assessments. So how can we continue to build towards that with that lens on risk and towards effectively managing those risks for the company? Because a lot of our conversation today has been about managing risk, or at least trying to. So have you found anything that any good ways or any practical examples of how we could make risk management more effective or more efficient?
Well, I think the first thing that you want to do is sitting down and getting the formality of it right. So going around using all the inputs, all the knowledge and expertise around you, the understanding the business and the industry trends to help inform the various different risk measurements, as well as choosing the right framework for your organization. Another area that I found that was really effective and efficient was understanding my company's appetite for risk and working within it or working together to manage that. Because I know sometimes we run into things where a company they want to do A and we're saying A is really risky. We don't think we should do it, but let's work together to see that we can make sure that we can manage this risk so that it's, good for us and good for me as well as, we're not jeopardizing the business objectives. But then that also comes down to a big thing that I find is company culture and support. The security department doesn't want to be seen as the big ogres coming in saying, no, you can't do this. No, you can't do that. We want to be seen as we're working in collaboration with the rest of the company and saying, we want to make sure that we can achieve the objectives that we have set out for us in our company statement, but we just want to make sure that we're doing it in a compliant and secure way because we don't want our reputation damaged and we don't want this company to go under because of something like a breach that we could easily have managed and worked with.
And now you're also describing throughout, like you talked a little bit about automation earlier, but I have the sense there's just a lot of pickaxe and shovel work here. Like, how much of this really is going to be manual work to up level an organization, and how much can you see that could be automated?
Well, speaking from experience, there was a lot of early manual work starting out, and I was just bringing the program together, finding out like my controls and finding out where all my evidence and bringing that all together. But once I started bringing it together, I started to realize I can automate a lot of this. And originally I tried to start automating this in Jira, and while Jira has its greatness to it when it comes to as a ticketing management system, it wasn't great for me as a compliance specialist. I needed something more alive. I needed something to remind me that you need to do this test, you need to pull this evidence. And so over time, as your company builds a more of a maturity cycle that will guide the growth of a risk program with the goal of having at least 80% of your work automated to be able to focus more on remediation plans and managing your controls effectively. So as we see here in the slide here, we have a maturity cycle, and this helps to measure the growth and can dictate a program when it's ready for further automation. And I know, speaking from experience, we got to a point where I'm like, we're ready. We're a mature security program. We're ready for automation now. So let's find a tool that will automate a lot of this and take off 80% of the workload on me so that I can focus the 20% on the areas that need focus on.
And I love that you've got a maturity model shown on the screen there. And I wanted to ask for those folks in the audience who look at this and they go, wow, we're like a level 1. Level 5 looks like it's absolute fire. How would you counsel them if you've never gotten really started? You're in that level 1, level 2. Like, where should people plan on getting started where they can get the most value?
I would start first with being finding a super focused objective. Then that was to help determine the framework that's best for your organization. And then once you've decided that framework and you have that objective, start doing internal self-assessments, figuring out where your program lands, what you're doing well, where can you improve, and what you need to have within your organization. And then that will also be informed by knowing your management objectives. What is the company trying to achieve when it comes to risk management, but also understanding your own job role objectives and what are you trying to achieve in those objectives. And sometimes it gets more involved. That means getting more involved in other areas of the business just to understand that input of what needs to happen in that security compliance program. And it's also employing an enterprise risk management approach. So looking at the company, like a company-wide holistic approach when it comes to risk management, because ultimately these risks, they're not isolated events. These potential exposures are not just going to happen in a vacuum. When they do happen, they're going to have a bigger impact to the organization and to a level. Like if you have so many people in a company who are falling to phishing scams, that's a bigger vulnerability at the end of the day. And so you need to be able to approach that in a more holistic way.
I want to rotate back on something you said there around managing risks, because one of those hallmarks of maturity for me is you set a risk register, and a risk register is inevitably examined by a risk committee, right? So, in your experience, what would you consider to be a normal and healthy number of risks that you'd see in a risk register?
And I know this is a bit of a big debate among a bunch of people, but I feel like for myself, like your risk registry is going to show risk. If you have 0 risk in a risk registry, there's something wrong. You need to be looking further deep than that. But if you have a risk registry that has like 300 risk in your company, what are you doing to yourself and why? Why do you need to focus on so many of those risks? That should be a bigger concern. I feel for myself, when you're approaching the board and getting ready for a risk registry meeting, you should be presenting like a risk registry of like 20 risks. You may have some that are going to go over that number, but eventually over time, you're going to have remediation plans that are going to move that risk from red to green and then off the risk registry eventually. But you want to be able to show those risks. And also when you're going to a risk registry meeting with your committee, you really want to bring to focus the high severity ones and the ones relevant to the business to focus on based on those current objectives, because often a lot of times that's what people are going to focus on. They want to focus on the risks that could potentially have a impact on the business as a whole.
And just on enterprise risk management, because you just said like maybe 20 risks, certainly not 300 risks, which I agree with you. I think 300 and 0 are two extremes that we can look at there. Supply chain is a bit of a hotness right now. So what about third-party risk? Like, should that be something that's held separately as a risk from first-party risk management, or have you found it to be effective to combine the two?
I have very strong feelings on this, and I feel that this is something that should not be treated separately from your first-party risk, because ultimately a lot of companies are acquiring a lot of third-party vendors to do a lot of client work, because we don't necessarily always have the skill sets within our own organization to do that. And you need to monitor those. Those are risks. That's like a big gaping hole. And if you're not making sure you're putting in place the controls that are protecting the organization as well as the individuals who are being hired on to do that work, that's a big risk. So I don't think that they should ever be treated separately. I think they should be treated at the same level as your first party risks as well.
Fantastic. Well, I definitely agree with you on that one. I think that the challenge is that previously companies have held cyber risk as magical. It's different somehow than business risk, and I would posit that in the year 2023, cyber risk is a risk. It is just a straight up business risk. You are going to go out of business irrespective of whether or not the origin was cyber or supply chain or manufacturing. They're all risks, and we should have a mature conversation just about risks, not about, oh, look, it's a computer, so it's different. But I see the clock here, and we've seen some great questions come in from the audience. So I want to thank everybody for spending some time today with us. And I wanted to ask, like, can we go through some of those? I think we've got time for audience questions, right?
Yes, we do. And we have some great feedback. Lots of questions coming in. The first from Sal. Kane, how did you first get organized from spreadsheets into a GRC tool?
So, this feels like one of those 12-step problems where the first thing is to admit you have a problem. And the good news is these days, like back in the day, it was normal to use spreadsheets and move them into a GRC tool. We recently did a study at Hyperproof and found that only 10% of companies right now are using spreadsheets for managing their risk profile. And I think it's a question of, first of all, observing that you have a problem and then saying, okay, are we at a level of maturity in our processes where we can take those data, take those internal controls, take those requirements, and then put them into something a little faster than Microsoft Excel or Google Sheets? And what most companies have found is that, yes, that does drive efficiencies. And the other thing that it does is it makes it a lot easier to relate. Like the thing that got me really onto this track is the relatability of controls and requirements across frameworks, your classic crosswalk motion. Yes, you can do it in Excel. Yes, it is a nightmare that you can hand to an intern that they'll never want to do cybersecurity or compliance again because that becomes their day job. But I would say that that's like really the big driver, is to identify those artifacts that you have in your program that work, determine, like, is there something that can actually automate this, and then take gradual steps towards that automation. Don't expect that you're going to, as we saw in the earlier slide, like go from a maturity 1 to a maturity 5 overnight. It definitely is a process.
Excellent. Our next question is for Jessica from Ariana. Jessica, what were the first reports you gave to your stakeholders, and what did they want to see?
So the first reports that I gave to my stakeholders when we started using an automation tool was our controls and the health of our controls. And they were able to say it was clear to them what controls needed more work on and what we needed to focus on to strengthen them. And it gave them more of an insight and understanding of the work that we are doing to keep our controls healthy. And the other big thing that our stakeholders were really excited about, the reports I was generating for our risk registry. They really loved how we moved out of, as Kane was talking about earlier, a spreadsheet. We moved out of a risk registry spreadsheet, and I was able to show to them, being like, the reasons why these very risks are concerning is because some of our controls are not healthy. And it was able to give them more of a full picture of what is happening, and for them to understand more of what I was required to do, and what kind of was like required from them at the end of the day to kind of help support this change in growth as well as organization.
And I just want to double click on something you said there, Jessica. You introduced the idea of control health, and that is not a standardized idea. But essentially, the way I understand it, the way I think you and I are talking about it, is that if a control regularly has evidence, if you can regularly verify that the control is operational, right, it's a pretty healthy control, right? Whether that's a vulnerability management tool or whether it's a policy that's signed and attested and by somebody managerial authority on an annualized basis, right? That's a healthy control. Anything else, like if it's either regularly doesn't pass tests of effectiveness, or just shoot, it's hard to get the data out of, so you don't really know if it's on, that's an unhealthy control, right?
100%. Yeah. Like you can gather evidence that something's happened, but I can say, speaking from recent experience, I've gathered evidence that this one particular subtask is being generated. But when I go deeper into it, I'm like, oh, well, people are just literally just clicking done, or they're not actually doing what they need to be doing. So I will say that control is unhealthy. And now I have to go back and I need to re-educate people on the process to make sure that that's not going to happen.
Oh no, I have an image of a rubber stamp in my head and checkbox compliance. Oh, that is a great question. Thank you to the audience member who put that one in. Do we have other audience questions?
Yes, we actually have a follow-up from Ariana. Jessica, do you ever run into obstacles when implementing a new tool?
It depends on the organization that I'm working with. To implement a new tool. Some in the past, I've worked with organizations where they'll be like, "Oh, you've signed up for this tool. Here you go. Off you go." But I've had a recent really good experience with an organization where I was set up from the get-go with an implementation specialist, someone who actually worked with me on a day-to-day basis to make sure that I was implementing their tool correctly so that I can use it more effectively. Because that's the one thing I've noticed in a lot in our organizations, but other organizations is it's great to get a tool to help you with the work that you're doing to track these controls or to track, ticket management. But if you're not being shown how to actually use it and what features are embedded into it to make that tool as and wonderful as it should be, then you've run into a problem and you're not using that tool effectively. So in my recent experience, I've actually had a very positive experience of working with an organization to be able to have a positive tool to use everything I need to do to make my compliance program as strong as it's growing to be.
Awesome. Thank you. Next, we have Jean. Jean says, hello from London. Kane, are you using quantitative or qualitative risk measurement?
London, I remember being in London. Nice town to visit. Really enjoyed it there. Thank you for attending. I'm not sure what time it is there. So when it comes to qualitative versus quantitative, and I've done executive advisory for Fortune 500. I've also done internal assessments. I think the majority of where we are right now in human history is quantitative. Because I have met people who are doing straight up fair, like at a financial institution, a Fortune, 500 company, where they can tell you, yeah, we're doing fair. It's a banger. And then you poke into it a little below the covers, and no, they're still using qualitative measurements to drive their model. So I think that the challenge we struggle with is not that one is more right than the other. This challenge is around building a narrative to your stakeholders. And if you can agree on the definition of the words high, medium, and low, and I would encourage you, that is an important conversation to have. So everyone understands that, like, what is a high reputational risk versus a medium reputational risk with a high impact versus a low impact, because that's not a conversation you ever want to have again. It's painful. Provided you've got that, like, agreed in writing, this is what these words mean. Qualitative and quantitative matters less because you're effectively managing your risk and you're enacting your fiduciary duty to advise the board on those risks. And if there are steering or directional changes they need to make, they'll make them, or they'll at least advise you that, hey, by the way, that's your job. Why aren't you doing that already? But I think most companies, like, if you're at qualitative, try and polish that, make it a little bit better. Don't necessarily think that you have to move to quantitative, because again, a lot of the organizations I've seen outside of fintech and financial services, like people who they've got quants on staff and they do money all day long, quantitative is very hard to get to.
Next question from Tim for Jessica. Did you have to build those dashboards yourself?
No, actually. So by using Hyperproof, those dashboards were actually built by the input information that I was inputting. So I was able to set up my configurations and say, this is what we're looking at when it comes to our risk registry, but it was all generated for me based upon the information that I was putting in, and which end up giving me the insight that I need to see that, oh, we've got some unhealthy controls that need some work over here, or I know I've got some, we need to start connecting. There's a couple of risks here that we're no longer, we've actually closed them off. So the dashboards were actually something that was built into the tool that was super, very helpful, because I tried to build dashboards on my own and it was not going very well.
Thanks so much. Next for Kane, can you ask, if you have a risk register, how often does your team look at it and make decisions about the risk?
So that's a great question. And having been a CISO at, this is my second CISO role, and having done risk management myself, I think there's definitely a wrong answer, which would be not looking at it at all, or alternatively having 300 risks. But ultimately, this is a decision that's going to vary by industry, and it's going to vary by the nature of the threat actor engagement, and also your level of risk and tolerance for risk. And I say that because, like, I think these days, a minimum of an annual review of your risk register from top to bottom is necessary. And I say that because, you might have a quarterly risk committee meeting. And the quarterly risk committee, they've got a defined amount of time. They're only going to cover the risks where the controls are unhealthy and where the risk is exceeding an organizational tolerance or threshold. But I do think it's necessary to, even though that, like, you might only be covering things that are on fire or potentially on fire, you need to go back and look at your data and say, okay, of those other risks that we believe 6 months ago or a year ago, we've adequately treated those, and the controls still look healthy. Has anything changed that would otherwise increase that level of risk or decrease that level of risk? And that allows us to make decisions about it. Now, as a CISO, I don't look at the risk register, right? As a CISO, you don't go, you're probably not going into the risk register. You're asking for your intelligence team to please give you a report, a briefing, or a dashboard associated with it. And inevitably that, usually happens before you're going to go talk to the board about, well, how are we doing, right? Because you're going to get asked at a board meeting. So, what was our relative risk profile last reporting quarter? What's our risk profile this quarter? How much money did you spend? And then why did the number change? And if you're a CISO and you can answer those questions based on what's in that risk register, based on what's in your intelligence cycle, you're going to have a good conversation. If you can't, LinkedIn is super popular these days because the board is going to just, they're not going to go easy on you if you cannot explain like where the money went and how your risk profile has changed.
Also, we have a great question from Jordan for Jessica. You showed 5 levels of security program maturity. Is that based on a published framework?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jordan. So, yeah, that is the capability maturity modeling, which is actually a formal process that is used by organizations to measure and improve their security programs and their processes. So, in the terms of security compliance, it's kind of like a set of characteristics and indicators that really represents an organization's security program's capabilities, what it's able to do, and its progression towards, as we were talking about earlier, automation of the various processes to make them part of a more of an effective operational structure. So these 5 levels help to show at which point an organization is ready to move to the next level of optimization. So like Kane was saying earlier, if you're sitting at a level 1 and you want to move to level 5, well, you've got to go through 2, 3, and 4, and it's going to be a bit of a process, but honestly, it's going to feel good when you start getting along in that process.
Outstanding. And we do have time for one more question. And Aziz asks Kane, what can we learn from the big security breaches to apply to our company?
So not knowing your company, I think the specific thing to take away from security breaches is it's no longer if, it's when, and it's no longer about the initial breach, right? Somebody steals your password and logs in as you. That's not even a breach for starters. The threat actors these days are sophisticated enough that they are going to move out of their landing zone. And what comes to matter is around the organizational ability to detect those, the organizational ability to quickly contain an incident before it becomes a breach, but also if you think about litigation and adversarial discovery that occurs if you find yourself in that nightmare world of working with external counsel where they're saying like, hey, prove us that there wasn't a breach, having adequate compliance documentation and evidence of control operation in a continuous basis that shows that your company has been doing everything reasonable. And at least in the United States, like Connecticut, Ohio, and Utah, all have put in cyber safe harbor rules, laws, I should say, that if you are breached and somebody brings a civil tort lawsuit against your organization, if you can prove, if you've got policy documents, if you've got evidence that you were doing something based on a published cybersecurity framework, NIST, CSF, or CIS, they don't care. It could be HIPAA, right? That you're going to have the judge just toss that lawsuit out. And that really can help in reducing the burden associated with post-breach incident response and legal response. So I think that's kind of the world we're moving towards, and the world we partially live in, is we need to be prepared for this, and we need to be able to defend our actions and have a historical chronicle of what we've done that's very easy to access. So we can show, yeah, we were doing everything right? Because breaches will happen. Like that's what we call them advanced persistent threat actors. They will eventually persist and get in. What could they do? How little could they do? And can you prove that you were doing the right things? That's what matters.
Excellent. I really want to thank Kane and Jessica. What an amazing way to kick off our virtual summit. We appreciate the excellent presentation and Q&A session. A thank you again to our sponsor, Hyperproof. We are going to take a short break. Join us for the next session titled Managing Security in the Digital Age. Thank you again, Kate and Jessica, and we'll see you in a moment.